First, I'd like to thank you all for coming to this panel event at the American Enterprise Institute. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to have these events and to welcome you all to them. I'm Dr. Vincent Smith. I'm Vince. I'm professor of economics at Montana State University and director of the American Enterprise Institute's Agricultural Studies program. The program has supported the work of a wide range of scholars that focuses on U.S. agricultural policy. Their work has resulted in a series of 18 papers that have been published on the AEI webpage, and hard copies are available, under the rubric U.S. Agricultural Policy in Disarray. And just a note, in a way that's a homage to D. Gale Johnson, the marvelous economist who ran the AEI program for many years and who was, in his era, clearly the most distinguished agricultural economist in the world, never mind the country. And Dr. Sumner studied with Dr. Johnson when he was at the University of Chicago. Is that correct, Dan? Yep. Yeah, and he was just a wonderful man. The other members of the panel are Dr. Barry Goodwin. Dr. Goodwin is the William Neal Reynolds Professor of Agricultural Economics at North Carolina State University and recent past president of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association, the leading agricultural economics association in the world. Dr. Goodwin will focus on what are called Title I subsidy programs, which include the so-called shallow loss programs that were introduced in 2014. Dr. John Begin is Professor of Agricultural Economics and Department Head at North Carolina State University, and he's widely regarded as the leading expert on U.S. sugar policy. John is also widely acknowledged as one of the leading thinkers about agricultural trade issues. Dr. Daniel Sumner is our fourth speaker. Dr. Sumner holds the Frank H. Buck Chair in Agricultural Economics at UC Davis and also served as what we would call today the USDA chief economist under the George Herbert Walker Bush presidential administration. On April the 12th, the chair of the House Agricultural Committee released his draft version of a new farm bill. In what was really an astonishingly atypical, purely partisan vote over a draft farm bill in that committee, the bill passed out of committee with no support from members of the minority party. The draft bill essentially would maintain spending on major subsidy programs at their current or moderately increased levels, notwithstanding the fact that overwhelmingly the majority of these subsidies go to large farm businesses who have little debt, substantial assets, and are at almost no risk of failing simply because of one year's bad outcomes in terms of price or yield. They're in fact structured to address those sorts of volatilities that every self-respecting manager of a farm would be fully aware of. Other programs are highly lucrative for some agricultural producers, and those programs would also be retained. And those programs include the current sugar program, which is couched as no cost to taxpayers, but certainly costs consumers and the food processing sector quite a lot in terms of higher prices and lost jobs. So all of this is taking place in the context of a financial environment within which the overwhelming majority of farms are in a financially sound condition. There are areas in certain commodities where prices have been low or costs have been atypically high. But if we look overall at the indicators of farm finances, gross farm revenues from market sales at around where you would expect them to be over the longer run, rather than focusing, say, on 2012, which was a record year for farm prices and farm incomes. And no one could reasonably expect that sort of level of prices and net farm incomes to continue. Farmers have very little debt. The debt-to-asset ratio is forecasted for 2018 by USDA to be 12.6%, fractionally down from last year. And commodity prices for many crops and livestock are at or close to their longer-run average levels. So in this general context, I want to begin the panel's program by giving the floor to Dr. Goodwin to discuss Title I programs.
Okay, great, Vince. Thanks, thanks everyone for coming, and of course, thanks to AEI for allowing us this chance to talk on foreign policy again. I'm going to mainly talk on Title I programs, which is typically has been the main commodity title of the Farm Bill. But before we do that, I want to say a little bit just about sort of the political setting and the economic setting. I won't read you this entire quote. I think it really is quite telling in terms of what's happening right now with the Farm Bill. It does note that there's been a 45% drop in net farm income, largest drop since the Great Depression, 50% drop since 2013. 1 in 10 farms are now highly or extremely leveraged, and I don't know where that statistic came from exactly, but this was Chairman Conaway's opening statement when the Farm Bill deliberations were beginning. If you look at farm household income rather, relative to non-farm household income or income for all households, you see the story's really quite different from the rhetoric. It has been above since the early 90s, both the mean income and median income. Now, of course, this does include income from all sources, but if you're concerned about the economic well-being of a household, you want to look at the whole. And the breakout by different occupations, it really tells the same story. Farms are typically much wealthier and enjoy higher incomes. You see the mean household incomes there. Vince mentioned the leverage rate, and the chairman's statement there was talking about 1 in 10 farms being in difficulty. You can look at this compared to other lines of credit. You see the farm operating loan there is performing quite favorably, in fact, compared to credit cards and student loans especially. But there's no evidence, low debt-to-asset ratios, low leverage. The loans are not delinquent by and large as a whole. So a few notable changes in Title I. I think the payment limit thing is the big thing that I've seen. Of course, we have cotton coming back in as a program crop through the oilseed. That was included actually in the 2018 Bipartisan Budget Act. But that'll certainly be prominent in the Farm Bill. Payment limits have been established on a person or legal entity level at $125,000. But the big change is eligible family members, each being eligible for this $125,000, includes first cousins, nieces, nephews, pass-through entities, S corporations, and so forth. And they happen to be exempt from any means testing as well. So essentially, this is my opinion, essentially, not that there's been binding payment limits. I think there's always been real difficulty in having a binding payment limit. But now it seems that the illusion of payment limits has really been set aside, I think. Won't go through all of this, but these are, I tried to highlight here using the EWG's database. They do a great job with consolidating these numbers just to give you an idea of what the different Title I programs are. There's probably some that I missed there, but by and large, Title I had been, over most of this period of time, the major source of farm subsidy payments, typically direct payments, and flexibility contract payments, which are the same thing, and then LDPs, market loss assistance in the late 90s was a big part of it. And you can see here which program crops are really getting the bulk of the support. Of course, corn, wheat, CRP, the Conservation Reserve Program, weighs in there heavily. And those are sorted by total. So the message is not the individual programs as much as the crops that really stand out, and the fact that there are a lot of avenues for getting subsidies to farmers, a lot of different programs. A lot said about concentration of payments. We could debate whether that's a reasonable thing to worry about or not, but it is the case, as you would expect. Agriculture is quite concentrated now, becoming more so every year, and the payments, which are based upon acres, base acres, or production, or whatever form they're in, tend to be concentrated among the larger farmers. So the top 10% are getting 77% of the payments. Top 20 is over 90%. Not a surprise. We've done several papers in this series and looked at how these different things are broken out. And I think under the 2014 Farm Bill, which is probably a pretty good predictor of what we're going to see going forward, except there's going to be some reallocation between PLC and ARC, which I'll talk about. But a lot of support has now been shifted into the so-called safety net of crop insurance. That's FCIC. 41% of the outlays now go to that. So we've seen a shift toward crop insurance, and in fact you can see it here as well, the so-called safety net. Premium subsidies and operating expenses and the like have largely replaced what had been the commodity-specific outlays earlier on. And you see also there was a big role for disaster assistance, which has also largely been replaced by subsidized crop insurance, heavily subsidized insurance. What strikes me, and we're doing some work looking at this right now, is just the fact that you have this great heterogeneity across commodities in terms of the direct support. Peanuts really stand out. We have a paper, Vince and I do, on the peanut program that I was surprised even, and I come from an area that grows a lot of peanuts, but support's really off the charts there. Sorghum, rice, cotton has always been a big one, and will be again, I think. As a share of the value of production, you see peanuts, rice, and cotton really stand out a lot, peanuts especially. So there was this ARC versus PLC election that farmers had to make in the Farm Bill that we're operating under right now. And interesting enough, they went with what was in their best interest, of course. But it turned out that corn and soybean farmers, were astute at seeing that ARC was a better deal. Rice and peanut farms, as you saw in the previous slide, the support is very strong there. They went with a PLC. There was some base reallocation and yield updating. That raises a lot of interesting questions about WTO obligations and whether there's a recoupling of support. My circles are off a little bit there, but it's just to see it, to show you that corn and soybeans and rice corn and soybeans heavily on the ARC at the county level. Rice and peanuts, just the opposite, very much in PLC. Now, when we're coming out of this high price environment, there's going to be shifting, as CBO predicts, a big shift toward what's going to be a more favorable program, the PLC, for all producers. And that's really because the high prices, the average revenue is being ratcheted down as we move farther and farther ahead. So there's a prediction that we'll see a lot of shift toward ARC. And you can get an idea here really what, this is a single year, but what the ARC program actually does. This is for corn growers. But the revenue, if they didn't have that in 2015, and if they did, and the Corn Belt shows up prominently as you'd expect it to. And these are the payment rates, typically, up to $75 or $100 an acre. Peanuts, I think, stand out a lot. It's largely because of what happened with cotton in the 2012, 2014 Farm Bill, but there is an issue with generic base, that cotton growers lost their base that became generic. They could grow any crop on it and be eligible for PLC, and we saw a 50% increase in peanut acreage. So there's the acreage is generic acreage is following the payments, and that probably will continue to be a big issue. Again, cotton base has been turned into generic base. Go back to cotton base now with the new cottonseed provisions. But you see that there is a distinction between what's actually planted and what the support is based upon, and it differs from commodity to commodity. And that's really the whole of it, Vince. I think the concluding message is I don't think the rhetoric matches the economic facts. There's, of course, as Vince said, there's differences, in among individual farms, but the trends are not nearly as bad as what we've heard.
In fact, we're back to almost normal long-run market conditions in general. And individual crops and individual commodities that farmers produce operate differently from the average. So you'll hear from Dr. Sumner about the dairy industry, which is a little bit different than, say, the peanut industry. I'm going to talk very briefly about crop insurance. Many of you in this room have heard me wax long and hard on crop insurance. I'm going to make a blunt statement. Farmers will not buy the sort of crop insurance offered unless it is heavily subsidized. And the evidence is compelling. And this slide shows it. We see in the early 90s and going back into the 80s, when farmers were getting a 30% subsidy on what's called the actuarially fair premium and not really paying any of the costs associated with administering the program, that only about 20% of eligible acreage signed up. When subsidies were increased to closer to 45% in 1994, we saw a surge in enrollment. And then in 2000, when the subsidies were increased to their current average level of around 62% of the actuarially fair premium, we see an even bigger surge. So now close to 90% of all acres are insured. Essentially, the farmer is offered the following. Every year, put down $1, and on average, you can expect just over $2 back. Great Las Vegas odds, if you could get them. And if we could get them, all of us would be fleeing from the room today, I suspect, unless we have strong moral views on gambling. And we know something else about crop insurance. It distorts decisions. Essentially, it transfers risk from the manager of a company, a farm, to the taxpayer. Because the farm will take a riskier bet. We've seen expansion to some degree, I don't want to overstate the facts, into more fragile lands where production risk is higher. The farmer gets the upside, the taxpayer pays for the downside. And that's just the way it is. One irony in this program is that roughly 30% of the taxpayer costs of the program flow to crop insurance companies. Some other comments. 3 crops account for roughly 65% of the total subsidies that we pay. Those crops are exactly the same crops that receive large subsidies under the programs Barry was talking about, and that's corn and soybeans. So it's no wonder that congressmen from Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, and so on are strongly supportive of crop insurance. Not a surprise at all. Cotton, peanuts, and rice, but cotton and peanuts in particular, also add a big chunk to the total payments. And the rest of the commodities get about 6 to 7% annually of the subsidies. So it's a concentrated thing. Just to see the loss ratio for the program. Now, this loss ratio is not the loss ratio that the Risk Management Agency wants to talk about. They say, let's talk about a loss ratio where we look at total amount of money going into the insurance pool. So that's the farmer's contribution plus the government's contribution. And that loss ratio is running right now at about 0.8, something like that, on average, long run. Barry? Barry's the expert on this.
Very close to 1. Really.
Very close to 1, really.
The congressional mandate is 1.
And so legitimately from their perspective, the Risk Management Agency will say, well, this is an actuarially sound program. This loss ratio shows payments out relative to farmer payments in. So that's the normal actuarial measure. And you can see that the loss ratios run on average at about 2.1. You make money off of crop insurance. That is what you do. Now, is it a risk management program? Yes, because you get paid when your yields or your yield times price is relatively low. But it's really an income transfer program, and a fairly substantial one, targeted mainly at 3 crops. And if you raise corn, you almost certainly in most parts of the country raise soybeans. So it's really what one class of producer is getting most of this money. We expanded subsidies to what's called revenue insurance, the harvest price option in 2000, and we saw a surge in the use of revenue coverage, mainly for corn and soybeans, which again are these crops that already get a lot of the money out of this program. What about proposals for reform or change in this program? Well, the House Agricultural Committee's draft bill has none, in effect, or very little would be perhaps applied away. The farm lobbyists claim that loss of the crop insurance program or any change would be catastrophic. Effectively, you will hear the claim quite often, we can't farm without crop insurance. A simple way to ask that question is, well, what did farmers do in the 80s? Where most corn growers and most wheat growers did not buy crop insurance. And the answer is they farmed perfectly happily. It was not quite as lucrative, it was a little bit more risky. You'll hear the banks say we wouldn't make loans if farms didn't have crop insurance. Well, what did they do in the 80s when only 20% of acreage was enrolled in the program? They made loans. Loan rates would be a little bit higher, probably a point higher in interest. They'd be riskier for the banks, but the world would not collapse. Now, clearly, some farmers might not survive, because some farms have actually built their entire operation around the fact that crop insurance is heavily subsidized and available to them. They have no land or very little land. They buy machinery and equipment, and they rent land. And they're high risk from any business perspective, operation absent crop insurance. Now, if you ask how many of those farms are like that, relatively few. We've seen the debt-to-asset ratio. It's 12.6%. What has the farm lobby's response been to the proposal for any proposal, for even minuscule cuts in the program? Well, basically, it's been the sky is falling. The world is going to collapse. And that's really a little bit of an overstatement. There are serious reform proposals that have come out of the House and the Senate, not out of the House Agriculture Committee or the Senate Agriculture Committee. One obvious one is to end subsidies for the harvest price option, which is an incredibly Cadillac version of insurance. In 2012, for example, corn growers who bought this sort of insurance actually ended up with more revenue from the insurance policy in the market than they expected to get when they planted the crop, which seems a bit ridiculous. The Trump administration has proposed cutting the subsidy rate. That's embedded in Congressman Norman's bill that was released just a week ago, a 15 percentage point cut. That would be about a reduction in subsidy of about a quarter. And providing insurance coverage for prevented planting is a serious proposal. There's a great deal of fraud and abuse, moral hazard issues associated with that, which my colleague Dr. Goodwin has researched. One proposal is simply to cap insurance premium subsidies on a farm basis at some maximum. $40,000 has been proposed in some legislation. If you load that cap to $20,000, still relatively few farms would be affected by this sort of cap. And double dipping. The shallow loss programs that Barry described are to cover shortfalls in revenue or price. Crop insurance does the same thing. One proposal is, which should be taken really seriously, is let the farmer pick one or the other, but not both. Essentially, the taxpayer is paying many farmers for the same loss twice. Now, if you're foolish enough to let me do that legally, I'm happy to do that. The question is, from a policy perspective, is that a good idea? And there have been other proposals to introduce a payment limitation criteria, making individuals who earn on their tax forms over $500,000 a year over the last previous 3 years ineligible for payment. So those are the serious reform proposals. not being taken seriously at all by the House Agricultural Committee, and almost certainly not being taken seriously at this point, at least, by the Senate Agricultural Committee. Although recently, the chair of the Senate Agriculture Committee has commented that he has some concerns about whether subsidies in crop insurance can be retained at their current levels. So with that, we're going to move on, and I'm going to pass the baton, or the clicker, to Dr. Bagan.
Okay, well, thanks, Vince. So thanks to the AEI for allowing to do this work. So what I'm going to do first is give you some stylized facts and context in the sugar markets in the US, looking at quantity produced, consumed, and some price and trade data. Then I'll move on to the key features of the sugar program, look at its impact, and then a few slides, or one slide on reform. So as you can see here on the left-hand side, you have the production of sugar in sugar equivalent in metric tons. So roughly sugar production in the US is about 8.5 million metric tons, with the larger share going to beet production and the lower share going to cane production. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that sugar use is roughly around 11 million metric ton, again with the production being reproduced there at 8.5, and then import making the difference between the two, and hovering around 2.4 up to close to 3 million metric ton. Okay, so the prices. So on the left-hand side here, you can see the data, some historical data on prices. On the top series, the blue one, shows the US wholesale price and then an equivalent world price below that. And you can see that systematically the US price has been way above the world price, so with an implicit tax on user of sugar and implicit protection to the producer of that sugar. And you can see also that peak around 2010-2012, where in a sense, USDA had problems managing the sugar program, and so extreme scarcity made price go to incredible high level. And so roughly that difference between the two prices, looking at the last data point, there is about $260 per metric ton, roughly. So that's kind of an equivalent value of the subsidy going to sugar, the sugar industry in the US, and going to the tax on producers. If you look at trade, so the total trade is there on top, the brown series, and then there is the TRQ, so those, I'll talk more about those tariff rate quotas. Those are quantitatively restricted trade flows. And then Mexico trade value, that's the blue series, which was, you can see the ramping up starting in 2008, when NAFTA was, in a sense, totally implemented, and there was no restriction on those sugar imports. And then the ramping up to 2014, and then the agreement the US and Mexico entered in, and so that limiting the sugar imports from Mexico to the US. In terms of the objective of the sugar program, it's also another transfer program. So the idea is to raise prices to the benefit of the sugar industry from growers on, and with no explicit tax payment, so there are no fiscal outlays, but the sugar users, so final consumers like you and I, or food processors who use sugar intensively in their production, like say candy makers or chocolate producers or other bakery industries use sugar and sweeteners quite intensively, and so those industries pay the high price of the sugar. Then there are really three elements in the sugar program. So there are supply controls on the domestic production and also on trade, and then there is a price system, and I will describe all those one by one. So in terms of the import, as I mentioned, we have country-specific tariff rate quotas. Those are bilateral quotas. They're based on historical trade flows from late 70s and up to 1981. So they're historically based and not currently based on the current competitiveness of those countries. For instance, Brazil and Thailand have very limited access to our market. There is low, very low, or sometimes zero in-tariff, in-quota tariff. So for any sugar coming under those quantities, predetermined quantities, there is no a trade impediment, for so to speak, in terms of a border tax. But then for any imports beyond that quota level, then there is a prohibitive tariff a little bit below 16 cents for raw sugar and above 16 cents for refined sugar. And so many of those TRQs, because they're based on historical flows patterns rather than current competitiveness, go unfilled. And so there is less sugar entering that could enter, and so it could be better managed for sure. Now, Mexico, as you have seen on the slide, the increasing level of imports, not that Mexico is very competitive worldwide on world markets, but the difference in price between the domestic Mexican price and the US created opportunities to export from Mexico to the US. And so that was disruptive enough such that there was political push to try to put a stop to that expansion of sugar. And so there were the USITC made some analysis of the market and found that there were countervailing duties to be added because sugar was apparently dumped from Mexico to the US. And so that created some leverage to negotiate with Mexico with a suspension agreement saying we'll suspend those countervailing and anti-dumping tariffs if you agree to limit your exports to the US. And so that's what took place. So there is a formula managed by USDA that dictates how much sugar comes from Mexico to the US. And there is also a minimum price set, which is way above the US loan rates and, of course, the world market rates. And so, in a sense, the Mexicans have a system that looks very much like what we had with the car industry with voluntary export restraint a long time ago. Many of you are maybe too young to remember those days, but Hondas and Toyotas were more expensive than they are now. So.
I got to say, some of us are not.
Other components, of course, in terms of domestic production control. So we have allotment or marketing allotment system. So first of all, there is an overall allotment quantity for the country. It's supposed to be no less than 85% of domestic use. It rarely goes that high. And then this overall allotment quantity is distributed across states and within states per sugar processor or sugar refiner, and so that's that detail. So it's pretty cumbersome in terms of the production. So even though the aggregate allotment is not binding, or reaching the 85% target of the domestic use, it can really distort production decisions because some of those producers can be very efficient, and so they're limited by the fact that they have a certain allotment, and then other producers who are not efficient also may not fulfill the sugar, and so there are some ways to reallocate those rights, but it's pretty cumbersome and also quite bureaucratic. So I think that's what is said. And so again, that aggregate allotment is based on the projection of USDA, looking at projected use, and there is also a formula to determine that allotment. The loan rate is the last important piece. So there is a sugar price support system. So it's not on the crops; it's based on the actual sugar. The rates are different for sugar beet, which is in a sense a refined or white sugar, which involves more refinement and one more process if you look at the cane sugar equivalent. So the cane sugar loan rate is lower at 18.75 cents per pound. And of course, that cane sugar is raw sugar. It has to be transformed into white sugar if you want to compare to the beet sugar price. And so that difference between the two prices is really justified by the fact that it takes roughly, you think about 5 cents for the cost of refining raw sugar. And so there is a forfeiture program. So if the USDA is not successful at managing the program and keeping market price above the loan rate, then sugar producers can in a sense, forfeit the sugars they put on loan, and USDA has to get rid of those inventories. And so there is the feedstock flexibility program, or the sugar for ethanol program, also it's known. And so USDA has to get rid of those inventories. And so, for instance, in 2013, USDA to spend about $259 million, basically auctioning that sugar at bargain basement price to make sure that it would go into ethanol. In terms of the impact of the sugar program, so as I mentioned, and as suggested by the data, so you have a big price, implicit tax, and so users pay, you can think of just a rectangle of 11 million metric ton of sugar use multiplied by that tax of $258 per metric ton, and that gives you a big rectangle worth about $2.8 to $4 billion. Of course, we're economists, so we think about incentive and price response. And so you have triangles of deadweight loss, but really the rectangle, as Julian Olstant, our colleague at UC Davis, would say, the rectangle is big enough and you have to focus on the rectangle. And so that rectangle is worth, depending on the year, between $2.8 to $4 billion of transfer. So the transfer to the producers, of course, is not as large. So farmers, sugar growers get something around the ballpark of $1 billion a year. The whole sugar industry gets about more than $2 billion a year. You can think of the 8.5 million metric tons of sugar production times that subsidy of $258 million per metric ton, and so that gives you roughly $2.2 billion of transfer from producers to from consumers to producers. So those are the kind of the figures and the magnitudes for the transfer. In terms of a U.S. household, it's not that big, so it's for a household of 4, it's $44 a year. In terms of the increase in the cost of the the food bill or an estimate of the welfare loss, so it's not big enough to call your senator and raging about the cost of the sugar program, but you multiply $11 by 300 some million people in the US, and then you get a figure of about roughly $3 billion in terms of the welfare cost. So it's diffuse. It's the typical political economy situation where you see diffuse losses, small losses to atomistic losers and very concentrated gains to a well-organized industry. In terms of job losses, it's about 10 to 20,000 jobs lost per year. So it's not cumulative. I want to emphasize that. So it's comparing a world with the sugar program versus a world without the sugar program. And so those are ballpark estimates. And so most of those jobs are lost in intermediate industries, in inputs going into food processing that's sugar intensive, and so there is trade diversion going on between Mexico, Canada, and the US, where companies try to abate the cost of the sugar program, and so they import intermediate goods that are intensive in sugar to bypass, in a sense, the cost of the program. And so that trade diversion cost about 10 to 20,000 jobs per year in the US. Proposals for reform, so that's my last slide. So as mentioned in the Modernization Act proposal put out in November, so loan rates could be lowered. So actually they're above 18 cents per pound for raw sugar, and so they could be lowered to a level that's closer to the world, a long-term average of the world sugar price, around 15 cents per pound. I think the Modernization Act proposal limits at 18 cents per pound, so it goes down by at least 75 cents, 0.75 cents. The sugar ethanol program or the feedstock flexibility program should be removed. So that cost, at least in 2013, it was significantly costly to taxpayers. And then, other proposals should, in a sense, manage the trade flows in making sure that the stock-to-use ratio is high enough in the US so that you don't have markets being so tight like it happened between 2010 and 2012, where there was not enough supply on the market and price shot up. In terms of the TRQ system, also a better management of the TRQs could take place and allowing them to fill more systematically. In the long term, in a sense, the sugar program should be removed, so we saw that the gains would be significant. At least the transfer from users to producers is substantial and should be removed. the issues we have with Mexico would disappear because the low-cost producers like Brazil, Thailand, and other countries could export to the U.S. more effectively, and we wouldn't trade with Mexico or much less than we do now. And so all those trade tension we have with Mexico on sweetener issues would disappear. So then one can think of an implementation period of several years to, in a sense, transit to lower market prices. But given where the world prices have been in the last few years, and a change in the world sugar market, with Europe becoming quite a large importer right now, those prices are supposed to stay quite high, and I think there is room for viable sugar industry with less subsidies.
Thank you. We're going to now turn to the fun topic of milk and some other issues with Dr. Sumner.
So I think you've seen enough numbers and charts and tables. And so I'm not going to do that for you. I have a lot of those in an AEI paper. I was in this room a few months ago. I guess I was up on the Hill a few months ago talking about dairy policy. 3 days later, the Congress did just the opposite of what we were talking about, what I was talking about. Joe Glauber at that time gave a paper about cotton. They also did just the opposite of what he was suggesting, so I didn't feel special. It's appropriate that we're here at the American Enterprise Institute talking about farm policy. From my point of view, American farmers are the most enterprising people I know. It's not just that they work hard and that the rest of us depend on them for our sustenance. What I mean is that they're constantly engaged in innovation, creativity, bold initiative. That's the definition of enterprise, by the way. That's what we mean by enterprise, is American farmers. I want to start off because I'm going to talk about dairy and I'm going to emphasize things a little bit different than what you just heard. There's nothing about U.S. farm programs, including dairy, that transfers money to low-income families. That's not what they're about. And in fact, they're not designed that way. They really haven't been since maybe 1935, but they weren't very good at it then either. And they're certainly not doing that now. And so unlike some of my colleagues, I may well disagree with Vince and Barry a little bit. I would say one of the good things about what's being proposed in this farm bill is we're removing the fiction of things like payment limits, which have been a fiction for a long time. Because what sense does it make if you're going to subsidize an industry to try to exclude the most productive firms in the industry? So if you want to transfer money to farmers, ship it to real farmers. Don't fiddle around the edges with screwing around with things. And in fact, what I would argue when it comes to dairy, it's probably because we are trying to target things to what I would say favored members of an industry. And industrial policy and picking winners and crony capitalism is bad enough for industries as a whole, but to pick out favored firms within that industry because they happen to have a better relationship with members of Congress than some other parts of that industry just seems really counterproductive and more dangerous than most. And that's what I want to talk about in the context of dairy. This idea of enterprise, though, is nowhere in agriculture more evident than in the dairy industry. In the piece I did back in January, I talked a lot about the remarkable productivity growth and competitiveness, a real transformation of the U.S. dairy industry over the last 2 or 3 decades from being an industry that had needed protection, big tariffs, not unlike sugar. There's residuals of that left. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But now we're a major net exporter of dairy products to the rest of the world because we have an industry that's really transformed itself, and it's done that by, in a sense, dragging policy along with it. So everything Washington's done, not everything, much of what Washington has done specific to dairy policy has gotten in the way of that, and the industry has not only transformed itself, it's transformed itself against the odds, so to speak, given the policy that they've faced. And this is not just the farmers, it's also the processing industry. Much like sugar, processing goes together with the dairy farm industry. They go together, and in fact, they go together so closely that 80% of the milk in the United States is processed by farm co-ops, that is, firms that are actually owned by those farmers. So it's a remarkable linkage there. Much of that productivity growth has happened actually in the Midwest and the East. They've caught up with the West when it comes to, for example, production per cow and some of the milk cost of production numbers. Not everywhere, but lots of places. There's been a decline in the number of cows. That stopped. Number of cows is roughly flat. Production per cow continues to go up, which means the dairy consumption of U.S. dairy products is rising. Production is going up, and we're exporting. So it's not just consumption in the United States that's turned the corner a little bit. Not fluid milk consumption. That's a serious problem, and that's partly due to policy. We have a policy to discourage American consumers from drinking milk. My friends in the almond, I'm from California, my friends in the almond business think that's okay. The dairy industry is not so much favored by that. And in fact, almond milk, soybean milk is a puny part of the soybean business. It's a significant part of the almond business. So I'm actually serious about the almond guys. Ironically, in California, the almond trees and the dairy farms are side by side, and the challenge is that almond orchards are replacing alfalfa hay and silage fields, in part as a matter of government policy by discouraging people from drinking fluid milk and shifting to things like almond milk. At the same time, we've had productivity at the farm growth. We've had innovative products, but again, they're against the odds. We all know the Greek yogurt phenomenon that really rejuvenated, re-energized the New York industry and had a lot to do with growth in Idaho as well. So the industry there has been innovative in the products that they're developing. But again, that's against the odds of farm programs where we've said, gee, we're going to tie if you're producing for Washington, it's got to be dry milk powder of a certain specification or butter of a certain specification, typically not the ones that the market actually wants, oddly enough. Now, I think the 2014 Farm Bill did the right stuff. It removed price supports. They were mostly irrelevant. They tied a bunch of high prices to the government actually buying products. We still talk about caves full of cheese that sat there until they rotted. If the dairy products didn't sit around until they rotted, we shipped them and dumped them on markets around the world. Nobody wants to go back to those days. They lasted for 40 years, but nobody wants to go back there. I think what I'm going to suggest to you in a couple of minutes is there's no reason to keep today's policies, which when we look back on them, we'll say, why did we keep those for so long? Let's get rid of them. Let's move forward. The other thing we got rid of was explicit export subsidies. We used to dump dairy products on the world market. We never liked to call it that, but that's what we did. We have explicit dairy subsidy policy. It lasted for a half a dozen years or so, and then it was outmoded, didn't make any sense, probably didn't make much sense to start with, but it stayed on the books until 2014. We got rid of it. That was a good step. And the 2014 removed the cleverly named milk program, MILC. It's irrelevant what that stands for. It was irrelevant at the time. What was fun was that it was called milk. And that was when there were payments when prices fell below whatever happened to be the congressional dictate of the time. Again, that was a program that didn't make a lot of sense. It didn't do anybody much good. It wasn't very much money. It wasn't. The dairy industry is a $40 billion industry, so you can't provide, Barry, 40% of the revenue of dairy farms out of the federal budget. And so to like you do for peanuts or like we used to do for cotton a decade or so ago. So those kind of monies aren't ever going to be there. And instead what we do is wrap up the industry with lots of complexities without much money involved. And so we have a lot of rules, and we do fiddling around here and there without actually having much effect. And we do that against an industry that's transformed itself. And I think what I've argued is it's time for the policy to catch up with the industry. That's what I've argued. Of course, not all the outmoded policies were eliminated. And with the 2014 bill, and the 2018 bill still has the opportunity to actually complete the job. The U.S. is a major commercial exporter of dairy products, and yet we still have lots of tariffs. If you went through the U.S. tariff lines for dairy, it goes on for pages of this, that, and the other. None of it does anybody much good. Particular companies, if I have to compete for a particular kind of cheese against some Danish company, then I want to keep that tariff there for me. But in general, for trade policy, it puts us on the side of the people we don't want to be on the side of. So my view is wipe that stuff out, join New Zealand and Australia in putting in the pressure on the real protectionist places like Canada and China. So if you want to have a trade policy for agriculture as well as other things that points to other places of being inappropriately protectionist, it's harder to do that when the U.S. has a set of trade barriers for sugar, but also for dairy that are sort of littered and all over the place. And dairy is different than sugar. Frankly, the United States isn't very good at producing sugar. We're a significant sugar producer because we keep the rest of the stuff out. For dairy, we're a commercial exporter. It's a different world. The other thing we've got still is the 1930s style Byzantine marketing order program that nobody can understand. It sounds like a federal milk marketing order, sounds like a Stalinist Soviet commissar kind of program. That's because it is. That's the style of program it is. There's no reason for me to go into the details of these programs. There's an old joke in the dairy business is there's only two people that understand the U.S. marketing order program, and they disagree with each other. There's various versions of that old joke in the dairy business, but the point is there's no reason to try to explain these programs here. They set prices for individual products. They differ across the countries. They've changed it. We've changed it a lot because as the industry transformed, it didn't make any sense to talk about the MW price anymore, and a few of you still know what that word means or that phrase means. But the point is there's no reason to try to dictate those things out of Washington, D.C. What I will say, however, is that the regulators here over at USDA, there's my time, I'm almost done. If I can get this thing to stop, there it is. The regulators over at USDA do a wonderful job. I really respect, I have friends over at AMS, and they do a great job of managing a program, basically minimizing the kind of distortions that happen in the market, given what Congress tells them to deal with. They are pulling levers and pushing strings and all kinds of stuff to try to manipulate dairy markets to not screw up the market too much. But they can't compete with letting markets work. They just can't do that, no matter how clever they are. Complexities have costs, and there's no degree of regulatory effort that solves that, even with people with great experience and expertise in trying to do it. Instead of course, the problem is the February Budget Act together with the House proposal on dairy go exactly the wrong direction. They don't do any of the reforms that I've just talked about. And the one place they change something is changing the so-called MPP program that replaced the MILC program. And the margin there, this margin protection program, which they've now proposed to rename but not change much, is the margin between a milk price and a feed price, obviously done in very complicated ways that somebody wants to fiddle with to make it a little more complicated. It is free insurance up to a certain amount of a margin, $5 in the new proposal, for the first now up to 5 million pounds of milk. That's about 220 cows or so. That is far below the average if amount of milk produced in the country. It is a tiny farm. Most of the commercially competitive dairy parts of the country. It is a very nicely sized farm for people that sell high-priced milk, expensive milk. And it might be organic, or it might be for a specialty cheese, or it might be for a local market. So the dairies that can find some consumers that are willing to pay a high price, but that has nothing to do with the government program, because they're getting a payment based on the government calculations of prices that have nothing.
1 minute.
Yep. 10 seconds, Vince.
Great.
So the final point on the MPP is there's nothing, it doesn't do the commercial industry any good. It subsidizes an industry that really has to be specialized in being far away from the NPP, that is selling expensive milk to people willing to pay for special characteristics. Under any interpretation, it makes the industry in general less productive and less efficient. So the broader point here is it's time to stop tinkering with outmoded programs in dairy and other things. It's time to let U.S. agriculture do what it does best, which is compete in the world markets and be efficient. And I think the kind of reforms we've been talking about here would do that. And the industry will be able to deal with its ups and downs, as there will be in agriculture, ups and downs. The industry will be able to deal with those in the same way that much of U.S. agriculture has for decades. The parts of U.S. agriculture that we haven't talked about here, the cattle industry, the pork industry, the fruit and vegetable industry, they've been dealing with these same things for decades without this elaborate government web. I'll stop with that, Vince.
We all overran by an average of 2 minutes, so I've cut into your Q&A time, and I do. We're academics. What else do you expect? We've got time for a few questions. Please wait until the microphone arrives if you have a question, and please keep it to be a question, not a statement or a speech. Jerry
Hagstrom from the Hagstrom Report. The lawmakers are saying that farmers are telling them that they're not interested in this farm bill, that they're mostly interested in the Trump administration's policies on trade and on ethanol. Obviously, that includes the steel and aluminum tariffs, in which there may be retaliatory tariffs. The reports are China isn't buying American soybeans anymore. I'm wondering if the Trump administration policies have affected your thinking, and also what you think about the Trump administration proposal to use the Commodity Credit Corporation powers to pay off the farmers if it turns out that there are tariffs that cause them to lose money.
You've got 4 economists who would all like to answer that question, and my bet is we'll all give you roughly the same answer. But Dan, would you like to take that one?
Well, I'm not going to talk about corn and beans and ethanol. That nobody that I know ever has any interest in that. But on Tuesday, I testified in front of the California Board on Agriculture. Karen Ross is our secretary, and we had leading farmers and others, commodity groups there. They're all very concerned about the Chinese tariffs. The ones that have already come into effect are hitting almonds and walnuts and pistachios and wine, etc. So it is a concern. And the point I would make there is that even if the tariffs don't happen, the rhetoric has effects. And we all remember even several months ago when we started talking about NAFTA, we export 40% of our dairy products to Mexico. When we started talking about NAFTA in a way that said, oh, maybe the U.S. will pull out, things will happen there, reasonable business people in Mexico got on the phone with Fonterra in New Zealand and said, I guess we have to think about, we love your California milk powder, but who knows? Your government or our government may get in the way. So I think the rhetoric matters, as well as we don't have to wait for the tariffs to hit before they start having an effects in trade. And that's the one point I'll make. That applies to almonds and walnuts and wine, not just corn and soybeans.
But
Well, let me talk about corn and soybeans. Not that I know much about them either, because I live in wheat country, but a couple of comments. First, we already have a plethora of programs. Corn and soybeans producers, almost all of them, like 99% of them, already have revenue insurance through the crop insurance system in place this year. They also, almost all of them, participate in these price loss coverage, agricultural risk coverage programs that are designed to pay off when revenues decline. They already have what one of my colleagues, previous colleagues at AI, Henry Olson, called a comfy cushion support system for when there are adverse movements in price and or yields. So it's a little difficult in a practical matter for me to see why you would introduce a special program related to the problems with trade. Now, having said that, the soybean producers have a legitimate beef with the Trump administration. Trade wars are a bad idea. And then designing policies to ameliorate a small set of voters, let's call soybean guys voters if you like, just to get a particular elected group of individuals a little bit out of a hole, seems not very good basis for policy. So A, there are policies in place. B, the right approach is not to go down the trade war line. I don't know of any serious economist who thinks trade wars are okay. There may be some people in D.C. with rhetoric where they claim trade wars will work really well, but serious economists just do not believe that. And the empirical evidence is devastatingly against the argument that trade wars or the threat of trade wars is a good thing. And that comes to Dan's rhetoric point. Next question. There's a gentleman here.
Yes, hello, my name is Jesus Torrilla. I work here in the delegation of the European Union. I would like to ask to Mr. Goodwin, do you think that the decoupled payments of the agricultural policy in Europe are less distorting than the commodity programs here or the insurance programs, or more or equivalent?
I'm not as John may want to address the EU policies, but I will say that decoupled payments, as they were initially designed, made a lot of sense from an economic point of view. It became politically untenable, I think, leading into the 2014 Farm Bill to make these payments that weren't tied to anything. It's interesting that we've gone in the U.S. away from decoupled support, and the EU's gone toward it. Crop insurance is directly coupled, no matter how you define it, and there's been some debate about that in the WTO, I think. It is being reported now, as I understand it, it's no longer subject to the de minimis exclusion. So, it's the base and yield updating provisions start to weaken this decoupling idea, because growers are allowed to update on the basis of what they were just doing. And I think we may see that again in this Farm Bill, but we did in the last one. So that's an issue, and I think you've written a paper on that issue.
Yes, those effects are moderate. I mean, it's the sum of several moderate effects with decoupling. We're never fully decoupled, but I think definitely you look at EU farm policy versus US, we have gone backward, and the EU has been progressing, especially specifically like in the sugar market, where the sugar reform in Europe has been very profound. And actually, what is interesting to see is the regain in efficiency, and in Europe in the sugar industry, which is quite much more competitive than in the US, and that was told, not to be competitive before the reforms.
And there is a lot of interest in crop insurance now in Europe.
So
subsidized crop insurance.
Yes, last year I attended an EU workshop on risk management, and there's a heavy push within the EU among certain countries to shift monies away from what's called the single farm payment into crop insurance, from the perspective of distorting programs that adversely affect the rest of the world. the single farm payment is clearly far less of a problem than shifting into crop insurance.
And I'd add one thing to what John said. We have done actually some research looking at the effects of the fixed direct payments, decoupled payments in the U.S. on production, and they're very modest, very minor. So I think it is, if you remove this updating provisions that they've allowed, it is a relatively non-distorting policy.
Next questions. Over to
Rick Pasco, Sweetener Users Association. One of the, I guess the only commodity that wasn't reformed in the last Farm Bill was sugar. And I guess it begs the question, what's special about sugar? Have any of you done any analysis of the income transfer from consumers and food companies to sugar producers versus what we have for other commodities?
Or relative? Well, the income transfer is, as I mentioned in my slides, so for any household in the U.S. or individual, it's small, so it's $10, $12 per person, and then to farm producer is quite high. So if you look at the average, I think farmer in the sugar industry is what on average. Of course, there is distribution, but it's more than $200,000 of transfer. I think you had some some figures.
It's an interesting question. So if I take the peanut program. Peanut growers right now get roughly 47% of their income from the taxpayer, mainly because of really poor policy setting in the 2014 Farm Bill.
Oh, I think it was very, very good policy setting, depending on your perspective.
Well, yeah. If you were Jimmy Carter's inheritor, you'd like this a lot. If you buy peanuts, well, if you're a taxpayer, not so much. So that's very substantial. If we go to corn, about 9% of a corn grower's revenues, I think, come from price loss coverage, agricultural risk coverage. It's hard to work out how much they're getting out of the crop insurance program precisely, but corn also benefits from the ethanol program, and so it's a little hard to compare. But if you go to sugar, the price of sugar is 50% higher than it would otherwise be. That puts it in the peanut range more than, say, the soybean range. It's a very heavily subsidized program. It's just that the subsidy doesn't come in a government check. It comes out of your wallet when you buy flowers, well, actually chocolate for your girlfriend on Valentine's Day.
You asked a very specific question about a transfer from consumers to producers, and most of these programs that we've talked about here are from taxpayers, and if anything, the U.S. price might be slightly lower. It's probably about the same as it would be. That is to say, consumers aren't, as consumers aren't being directed. And one of the reasons, Barry and Vince are talking about the 2014 Farm Bill. If you remember back a decade or so, we used to have a peanut program that was much like the sugar program in the sense that we had trade barriers and we had limits on how much they could produce. And that limit how much you produce meant that consumers paid for it here in the United States. Now, we don't have competitors around the world like for sugar, but the consumers used to pay for the peanut program. It used to be free in terms of the federal budget. And to get the kind of support that they were getting before, takes a lot of tax money per farm. And I think it is, I once did an AEI presentation. I was very impressed with the guy that was representing the sugar folks, had walked by a Starbucks before he came to the meeting, and he held up his packet of sugar and he said, I picked it up for free. How the hell cheap does Sumner want it to be? And I thought, gee, that's a genius. I wish I would have thought of that. That was, now, 30-second thought, you say, no, that wasn't free. That was built into everything else around the Starbucks. But it is true, and John made this point, that individual sugar packets still aren't going to be very expensive. And if you can charge $3 for a cup of coffee, you can give away packs of sugar.
One thing to comment, though, the sugar program does cost real manufacturing jobs in the United States. That 10 to 20,000 number is a serious number. You will hear very grandiose claims from the pro-sugar policy group about how many jobs are created. Those numbers are really, in my view, somewhat imaginary. The story, well, there are all these farmers making sugar and they won't have a job. We forget, land is land. And while you can't shift an acre of land from the Red River Valley or the Yellowstone Valley for that matter, you can sure grow a different crop or use it for a different purpose that will generate you quite a lot of revenue. So these stories about the employment effects are really quite imaginary stories. Some of the numbers that one has seen sort of boggle the mind. Boggle the mind would be the right phrase, and beggar the intellect.
I want to make just an unrelated point, really, but this issue of payment limits and big checks being sent to wealthy growers. In no way am I being critical of the growers for taking those payments. I certainly would too. I mean, it's the way the program is designed. Don't tell me that we're saving small family farms with these large payments, but I had a friend that was an attorney that worked on, his specialty was getting around payment limits, and he told me this 10 years ago, Congress cannot design a payment limit that I can't beat. And I believe that's right. It has been right. So what Dan said about these payments these limits not being binding is largely true. Whether you like it or not, it's a different question. And I think that the fact that we could have limits on payments, limit on subsidies, really could create their own distortions in terms of lost efficiency. So,
I'd like to have one addendum. None of us blame individual farmers for taking advantage of policies that give them legal opportunities to acquire taxpayer dollars. One might have a different perspective about the lobbying groups that seek to acquire those policies in the first place. That doesn't mean to say one has to approve of lobbyists using campaign contributions, etc., to obtain programs that benefit a small number of people. So there's a distinction there.
Yeah, and
it's
the question is, what are these programs intended to do? That's the fundamental question, I think, that you have to ask.
We've got time for one more question. Who's the older? Sorry, I have to have a criterion, right? Well, I could have asked who's the uglier, right? That would have been very unpopular. Go ahead, please.
Mark Langevin from the Brazilian Cotton Producers Association. I wanted to get back to crop insurance because obviously, as Vincent showed, this is where a lot more money is coming from. Aside from maybe just a sensible policy change towards more getting yield coverage back in the play, what are some of the other sensible guidelines, maybe not for this upcoming farm bill, but in the future, would be appropriate for the federal government to finance or to partially finance in terms of creating a sensible, fiscally sound crop insurance framework for maybe the major commodities, but also other agricultural products that people want here in the United States, whether it's locally sourced or whatever.
The only rational policy, I want to be careful what I say here. The one policy that I think all of us would agree has been beneficial, or the one use of funds that has been beneficial, is the investments in publicly funded R&D. And I don't think there's any ambiguity that the returns that the public have gotten from those investments is substantial. So that's one place. Depending on your view, I would argue you can make some case for what are called disaster aid programs linked to seriously adverse weather events. 90% of yield loss for crops, whether we're talking about boysenberries, kumquats, not that I know of anyone who grows kumquats, or corn, come out of weather-related events. So a disaster program based not on the individual farm, but let's say on areas 12 by 12 miles wide, so that your loss doesn't determine your payment, which leads to all sorts of problematic behaviors. But rather, yeah, there really is a catastrophic event. It's here. You're in this particular area. Let's make you good to some degree, not to 100%. I mean, why would one do that for any other industry?
I was going to say, I mean, that there's lots of industries that face random weather shocks and events that we
true.
don't put $10 billion a year into in subsidies for risk management. We do have a very viable range of risk management options that exist, and I'm convinced, Vince and I have debated this a lot, that the private market would come up with a lot of innovations, and has and do. There are even private crop insurance opportunities out there. So I don't see the justification. You talk about systemic risk and private markets can't handle that. That's nonsense, I think. I mean, the private markets are handling much more systemic risk than what you see there. There is a role, perhaps, in making the public data available for NAS, USDA does a great job getting that information out there. The government can probably do that as well as any private concern, but perhaps not. I don't know. But I'm not persuaded that even in that case, and you make the same argument about flood insurance as well. It's just,
I don't often come across as the kinder, gentler guy here, but
you surprised me, Vince. I'm disappointed.
Well, I know. I'm just a failure. Essentially, I agree with Barry. The government has got its fingers in a whole bunch of agricultural pies that get in the way of innovation, change, improvements in efficiency.
One thing that I didn't mention earlier, it was in one of the slides, but it is true before we had this big insurance program that these farms were functioning and everything, but we also had this ad hoc disaster relief issue that every time, why buy insurance when you're going to get a check if you have a real loss? And that distorted really participation in the insurance program because low risk individuals were adequately covered in some sense by ad hoc disaster relief. Congress did not have the discipline to refrain from writing those checks periodically, and I think that's been used to justify crop insurance to some extent.
We could talk about this for a long time. We've overrun our scheduled time by several minutes. The panelists will be around for a few minutes if you'd like to approach them one-on-one. Thank you for your tolerance, your patience, and your questions. And we look forward to seeing you all at other AEI events, not just about farm programs. After all, agriculture is 1% of GDP, but the wonderful array of programs that AEI offers. Thank you.